spoke a little bit about a lot of products that are mislabeled now. So you have to be careful with that.
I guess you must have had a big crowd for the daf today because no one's here.
Yeah, because people came to the Shabbat Chagotel Drush. Let me just minimize this screen. I think this is good. Just back here. It was like a screaming match because Finkel was saying shear the same place because he couldn't say shear in the back room where he usually says shear because Rabbi Reese was saying shear there.
Right.
It was a symphony of either a symphony or it was a horror story. Depends on your perspective. Okay, so it says in the parsha where it discusses the karbonos that are brought. It says the carbon of the Mitzorah. So let's see what it says over here. It says
have we started?
we're getting started. I was just going to mention something that we learned in this week's part. We learned two things in this week's parsha that's very relative to what we learned in Yevamos. So I just wanted to quickly.
Where are we up to? Where are you starting from?
We're starting from the top of Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. That's where we're going to start from. So the Gemara says that when you bring your karbanos at the end, when the Mitzorah is becoming Torah and he brings karbanos, it says in the Kachatos Ka'asham Hu. Let me see if I can find it. Kachatos Ka'asham Hu. It's in Perik Yud Dalet, Pasuk Yud Gimel. It says V'shachat es a keves b'mkoim asher yishchat es a chatos v'es ha'oila b'mkoim ha'kodesh ki kachatos ha'asham hu l'koyin kodesh kodeshim hu. So the pasuk says the chatos is like the asham, and Rashi, quoting our Gemara in Yevamos, says Umat Talmud Loimer. Why does it have to say that the chatos is like the asham? We already know that the chatos is like the asham. So Rashi says in Hula Koyin, he says, Shaloi Toimar, don't say, Hoyel v'yotza domai mechlal shar ashamois, li nasan al tenuchu v'hainois, since the Torah is telling us that this particular asham is different than every other asham, because we take the blood from this asham and we put it on the thumbs and on the toes and on the ears of the Mitzorah, so you might think it should no longer be like a regular asham or a regular carbon where you spritz blood on the mizbeach. Therefore, I would think lo yehi ton matan domim ve'imurim l'gab mizbeach l'kach nemar ki chachatos ha'asham hu. That's why it says chachatos ha'asham hu, because the asham was yotzam in aklal. The asham was yotzam in aklal, and since the asham was yotzam in aklal of a regular ashamish, because it's telling us to put the blood in weird places, I might think that you no longer follow any rules of the asham, and therefore the Torah has to say, no, it's like a chatos, and still follow the rules, still use the matan davim. So I don't have a siddur in front of me, but we say that at the end of the Brayso of Yishmael, kol dover shayu b'chal v'yotzam min aklal. It's the lashon is you can't put it back into the klal ad sheyachzirenu hakosov b'feirish. Does anybody have a siddur?
Yeah, 1 second. We're talking about the Yud Gimel Midos?
Yeah, so it's the second or the third to the last. The third to the last of Yud Gimel Midos in the Brayso of Yishmael. So that's what this is. This was Bichlal of all other Shamois. The Yotzan Lidim B'Davar Chodosh. The Torah took it out to tell us something unique about it, and that you put the blood on the ears and the thumbs. So what's the final? Ad
sheyachzirenu hakosev l'chlal b'feirish.
And that's what this is. The kachatos ha'asham is that. It's the Torah putting it back to Ferish. So if it wasn't for the fact that the Torah said kachatos ha'asham, I would have said that the asham is different. This particular asham is different, and therefore it doesn't have any other rules of the Karbanos. You don't spritz the dam on the Mizbech, you don't makrib the murim on the Mizbech. But here the Torah was Echseren Beferish. And where was it relevant in our Masechta? It was relevant on the test when the Gemara was looking around. How do we know that all the other arayis are not waived when it comes to Yibum? Only Eshazach. So the Gemara in Daf Test says that Eshazach is Davar Shaya B'Chlal because it was one of all the arayis, and it was Yotzim and Achlal. What was the wording again? In the brayso, v'yatzim l'chal for what reason?
V'yatzim lidom b'davar hachodesh.
V'yatzim lidom b'davar hachodesh. Eshazach was taken out lidom b'davar hachodesh. That by Yibum, when someone dies without children, there's no Isra Eshazach, so you cannot put it back into the klal until the klal puts it beferish, and that the Gemara applied this limud that we're learning here. The Gemara applied this this principle that we're learning here in Mitzvah to that. Well, Beryl first is calling. 1 second. Hello. I see you got cut. You got cut out, and then you can't come back in. You're not coming back in.
That's right. I can't come in.
What's going on when you try to come in?
I don't know. I'm trying.
So let's make sure you have the right room. It's 603-550-7613.
I've been trying that. I can't get in.
And when you click on it, what happens?
I'll try again. I'll tell you.
And it just spins and spins, but doesn't go in.
550
7613.
7613.
Right.
Join. It's waiting.
You're not just coming in automatically?
It's not there. It's just waiting. Usually it comes in waiting. And then you have to put it to 129, 129.
And it's not giving you that option now.
It's not giving me that option.
I don't know.
Maybe his Wi-Fi isn't.
Maybe your Wi-Fi is not connecting properly. It could be your Wi-Fi is weak now. Maybe there's an issue with your internet. So the valve could go on the phone.
Yeah, my internet is on.
I don't know. I don't know the answer. But this worked. So I didn't really start yet. I was still talking about this week's parsha. So one of the principles that we encountered in Yevamos is in this week's parsha, and the other principle that we encounter a lot of times in Shas is v'shava koyin uva koyin. The Gemara says whenever you have exer shava, the two words that you're matching don't have to be exactly the same as long as they're similar. And in our parasha this week is exactly where the Gemara always brings a raya from V'shava koyin uva koyin. So if you look in the parasha of Negoyim of Nigei Batim, the Torah tells us that if someone has a nega in his house, then he calls the koyin, and it says in the pasuk, the koyin comes and tells them to lock up the house for a week, and when he comes back, if the nega spreads, he has to pull all the stones out. So it says in the pasuk, after the week, the kohen comes back. The pasuk uses the word v'shova kohen b'yoyim hashvi. The kohen comes back after the seventh day, and if the nega spread, he takes out all the stones and all the plaster and replaces them. Later on, the pasuk says uva kohen v'ra, and we learn that uva kohen is referring to if he came back after the first week and it didn't spread, they lock it up for a second week. And the second week, if it spreads, he does the same thing. He has to take off all the stones and replaster. So we make a gzera shava from the word v'shava koyin in pasuk lamites, where the Torah tells you specifically that when the koyin comes, he removes all of the infected stones and replaces them. And we learned to uva koyin, which means the same thing. The koyin comes back to the house after it being locked up for 7 days, and we say just like the word v'shava koyin meant that you take off the infected stones and you replace them, so too when it says uva koyin means the same thing. So this is a theme that we always find through Shas, that you don't, when you make a gzera shava, the words don't have to be the same as long as they basically mean the same thing. V'shava koyin uva koyin. So those are two things that we learned in this week's parsha that we just recently encountered in Maseches Yevamos. So I always like to mention that because it brings the Gemara alive. The Gemara is actually basing its Torah on the Gemara, on the Torah, which is very consistent with our beliefs. Okay, so now let's get started on today's daf. Now today's daf, it could be complicated, but with a couple of hakdomas, it's quite simple. So I just want to mention what we learned on Friday. The whole sugya started off with the issue of Ein Yisur Chalalis. And on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, the Mishnah brings a case where two brothers got married to two sisters. So our usual case is Reuben married Leah and Shimon married Rachel. So of course, if Reuben dies, Shimon may not do Yibum on Leah because Shimon is married to Leah's sister. So the Gemara brings a brisa and discusses what if Shimon illegally, wrongfully made Yibum on Leah. It's a horrible affair. So the question is what did he over? So Rab Shimon says he's only over one of the two. He's only over Eishesach. And Rabbi Yosy says, no, he's over two. He's over Eishesach and a Chosisha. And the Gemara was probing to understand why you would be over both. Because why don't you say Ein Isur Chalalis? So the Gemara actually tried to figure out who got married first. If Reuven got married first, then Leah became usher to Shimon right away because of Eishesach, because it was his brother's wife. Then when Shimon marries Rachel, there's going to be a problem with the second Isser of a Chosisha being Chal, because this woman is already usher to Shimon because of Eishesach. So the Gemara tried to probe the opposite way. What if Shimon got married first? Shimon married Rachel first, which automatically made Leah usher to him because Leah is now his wife's sister. And only after that did Reuven marry Leah. So the Gemara tells us that there's something that's called Isser Moisef. Since when Reuven marries Leah, not only does Leah become usher to Shimon, but Leah will become usher to all of the other brothers in that family. So therefore, the Isser Eishesach will be chal upon the Isser of a Chosisha. So even though Shimon was already usher to Leah as soon as he married Rachel, because it was his wife's sister, nevertheless, when Reuben at a later date marries Leah, the Isser of Eishesach will be chal on Shimon as well, because the Isser Eishesach is chal on all of Shimon's other brothers. However, Zok Gemara, if you look at it the opposite way, in a case where first Leah got married to Reuven, so that means first there was an Isser of Eishesach. The moment Reuven married Leah, now Shimon and all his other siblings may no longer marry Leah because she is Eishesach. Even if Shimon marries Rachel at a later date, which should really add the Isser of a Chosisha, it won't work. Why? Because when the Isser of a Chosisha gets added, no more men are becoming Nesar because of this. Shimon's usher to marry Leah because Leah is Reuben's wife. By marrying Rachel, it won't add another Isser for Shimon to marry Reuben's wife because it's already usher because it is his brother's wife. So the Gemara said, based on that, the Gemara didn't really have an explanation as to why Rabbi Yosy said that he's over both of theirs. Rabbi Shimon makes perfect sense. He's over only one of theirs because Ein Isser Chalal Isser. But why would Rabbi Yosy say that Isser Chalal Isser? Isser Moisef only works if first it was a Chos Isha. If first Shimon got married, and that's why Leah is usher to Shimon because it's his wife's sister, and only later Reuven gets married to Leah, which would add Isser Eishesach. And we say, since the Isser Eishesach is going to be chal on all of Shimon's siblings, it will also be chal upon him. But if Reuven got married first, and already everybody, all the brothers are usher to marry Leah, so even if Shimon marries Rachel later on, and now it becomes a Chosisha, that Isser is not chal. So the Gemara brought up another thing. There was Isser Moisef, and the Gemara said, but what about Isser Koilo? Maybe there's another reason why the Isser should be chal. maybe a Chosisha should be able to be Chal on the Eshesach. Why? Even though there's no more men becoming Osir, but when Shimon marries Rachel, not only is Leah going to be Osir to him, because Leah is Rachel's sister, but if there's 6 other sisters in that family, all those other sisters are also going to be Osir to Shimon. That's called Isser Koilel. And to clarify how this works, I had to use an example that maybe people wouldn't be comfortable with, and that is I'm referring to the woman as a piece of meat. As a piece of meat. So if this piece of meat was only Osir to me, and now it's going to be Osir to many other people, that's Isser Moisef, and that works. But Isser Koil means that this piece of meat will not be Osir to any more people. But to me, not only will this piece of meat be Osir, but many other pieces of meat will be Osir. So the Isser isn't spreading to more people, but the Isser is on more objects to the same person. That's called Isser Koil. And the Gemara says, we can't even suggest that Rabbi Yosy holds of Isser Koil. Even if Rabbi Yosy holds of Isser Moisef, he doesn't hold of Isser Koil, which means we have a roadblock. Why is it that Rabbi Yosy says that there's 2 Isurim involved if first it was an Eishes Ach and then it became a Chosisha? And that's the problem that we had on Friday. And the Gemara, because of that, had to settle for a not such a Geshmak of Pshat in Rabbi Yosy. And the Gemara says when Rabbi Yosy said he's over 2 Isurim, Sayach Chosisha and Sayach Zach, it doesn't really mean he has to bring 2 carbon chatases if he did it b'shoigig. All it means is if he did it b'mezid, we're going to treat him like a bigger Russia because he did a bad thing. And the example of the Gemara gives is we'll bury him in a cemetery with people who are Rishoyim Gemurim. So it's not such a Geshmak of Pshat because Rabbi Yosy says there's 2 Isurim, and we're saying no, it really ain't Chal Isser. It's not really 2 Isurim, but it makes him bad. And that's how the Gemara remained with Pshat in the Machlokes Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon. And we're going to come back to that Machlokes, and we're going to try to find some other way to understand Rabbi Yosy where maybe we'll be able to have Isser Chalal Isser, because that's really what we need. We need a solution for Isser Chalal Isser. Because Rabbi Yosy doesn't hold of Isser Koil. And it was very scary to say the shir today in shul, because all these yeshiva bacham are back from yeshiva, and I'm at the top of my lungs screaming, Rabbi Yosy doesn't hold of Koil. And if that gets out, I'll never be able to marry my kids off. So I had to make a big disclaimer that we're not discussing Shidduchim here. We're discussing the concept of Isser Chalal Isser. And only there Yosy doesn't hold of Koil. Otherwise, you don't have to worry. But don't worry, I hold of Moisef. So I'll give more. How much can I? Okay, so we'll put that aside. So basically what we're holding now is Rabbi Yosy holds of Isser Moisef. He doesn't hold of Isser Koil. And therefore, we don't have a good explanation as to why both Isurim are there, both the Isur of Eshesach and Achos Isha, and because of that, we had to say that it's only about burying him in a place with Rishon Gemor. That was the first part of what we learned on Friday. The second part of what we learned on Friday is we were introduced to a machlokes. If there's 1 Isur or 2 Isurim, in a case where there's 2 Isurim at play, and Reb Chia and Bar Kapara had a machlokes if there's 2 Isurim or only 1 Isur in 3 different cases. And let's analyze and review the 3 cases, because that's what we're focusing on today. The first case was a Zor, such as a Yisrael, who did avoda on Shabbos. So there's 2 Isurim involved. There's 1 Isur of a Yisrael is not allowed to do avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. And if the avoda happens to be a malacha on Shabbos, such as Shchita, then he's over for Shabbos as well. So Reb Chia said, if a Zor does Shchita on Shabbos, he does avoda, he's chayiv twice. He's chayiv for being over on Shabbos, and he's chayiv for being over that he did avoda when he was a Zar. So it's b'shogig, there will be 2 chatoyis. Not sure if there's a chatos for a Zor, but there's 2 averos there. Bar Kapara said, no. There's only 1 aver. So that's machlokes number 1. Machlokes number 2. You had a kohen who was a balmum. A kohen who's a balmum cannot do avoda. We also know that a kohen who's tamei is not allowed to do avoda. But we have a rule when it comes to karbanis tzibur. If everybody is tamei, tumah hotra b'tzibur. So what happens if a kohen who's disqualified from doing avoda because he has a mum What if he did avodah when everybody was coming? Again, do you say that since Tom Hutter B'tzibur, he's only getting petch because he was a Baal Mum? Or do you say since he was a Baal Mum, he doesn't get that waiver of Tumah, and therefore he gets petch twice, one for doing the avodah as a Baal Mum, and one for doing an avodah as someone who's Tameh. Again, the same machlokes between Bar Kapara and Reb Chia. Reb Chia said he gets petch twice, and Bar Kapara says he gets petch once. And then the third case was Azar Sha'achal Malika. We know that the karbonis of birds, they don't shech the carbon. The kohen just breaks the neck of the bird with his thumbnail. That's an avela. If you kill a bird that way and you eat it, that's an avela. But by the carbon, that's the way it's supposed to be done. And the kohen eats the meat of an avela. So what if a Yisrael, if a Zor eats the meat from this type of bird? There's two Yisraelim involved. A Zor is not allowed to eat kachim, and B is it's an avela. So we want to know: does he get petch for a Zor eating kachim and the fact that he ate nevela, or maybe the nevela is waived? Reb Chia said there's both isurim. Bar Kapar said there's one isur. So it's these three cases that we're going to analyze tonight, and that takes us to the very top of Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. And the Gemara asks, "B'may kamifli?" What is the reason why Bar Kapara and Reb Chia argue in these three cases? Once again, let's just review the three cases. Case number one was a Yisrael who shechted in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. Does he get two petch or one petch? Number two, Al Kohen Baal Mum, who wasn't allowed to do avodah, who did avodah when he was tamei, when the whole tzibur was tamei. And number three is a Yisrael who ate a bird of kochim that Malika was done on it, so it's an aveda. So what is the machlokes as to whether or not he's over both Yisurim or only one? Zok Gemara be'Isur Koil. The machlokes is, what is the status with Isur Koil? So until now, we brushed off Isur Koil, and we said everybody agrees that Isur Koil does not work. You will not say Isur Koil, Isur Koil. But now the Gemara says, you know what? Let's take another look at Isur Koil, and maybe Isur Koil is a reason to say Isur Chalal Isur. So now we want to say, let's go back to that Mishnah, that Brisa that we had yesterday, where Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon were arguing about someone who did jibum on his wife's sister when he wasn't supposed to, and Rabbi Yosy said over there that you get petch, or he brings a chatas, saifra achos isha, and saifra ishazak. We said if you say Isur Koil, then it would work fine to say Isur Chalal Isur. So maybe we could revive that shot a little bit, and maybe let's say that that's precisely what Reb Chia and Bar Kapar are arguing about. They're arguing about what Reb Yoshi's opinion is. If Reb Yoshi's opinion is that you say Isur Koil, well, then we can really explain Reb Yoshi beautifully, that it doesn't make a difference if Reuven married Leah first, or if Shimon married Rachel first. It doesn't matter if the Eishes Ach came first, where Achoy Sisha would be added because of Isur Koil, or if Shimon married Rachel first, where Achoy Sisha came first, and then Eishes Ach is added on because of Isur Moshe. Either way, both Isurim will be Chal because Rabbi Yossi holds of Isur Koil. That's what Rabbi Chia would hold. Bar Kapara would still have to go back to our old suggestion that Isur Koil doesn't work, and what Rabbi Yossi means with the two Isurim is that you're considered a Rosh Hashanah. So those are the two options that we have. And let's say there's actually a machlokes in how to understand Rabbi Yossi. And with Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi has a real case of Isur Chalal Isur, which makes it so much more Gishma. So let's say Rabbi Chia Tavar, Rabbi Yossi be Isur Koil Mechayev Tarti, where there's an Isur Koil, there'll be two Averis, which means the Isur Achoy Sisha will chal upon the Isur Veishasach, because Achoy Sisha answers all the other sisters to Shimon. And Bar Kapara Sofer loy mechayiv elachada. Bar Kapara says it doesn't work, and therefore he has to remain with the pshat that we said yesterday in Rabbi Yossi. So Frank the Gemara, umay Isur Koil ikahach. We had three cases. How does Isur Koil apply to the three cases that we discussed a moment ago? Zok Gemara, let's go through them one by one. The first case was Zor. Bishlem is Zor. The case of the Zor. So what was the case of Zor? It was a Yisrael who's not allowed to do avoid in the Beis HaMikdash, and he did avoid on Shabbos. So the question is, does he only get petch out Zor, or does he get petch for Shabbos as well? So Zok the Gemara, Meikara Shori b'Malacha. until Friday evening, the Zor, like anybody else, is allowed to do malacha, because during the weekday, there's no prohibition to do malacha. But v'asher b'avoda, during the weekday before Shabbos, there was already an isser upon the Zor to do avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So the first isser that was there was the isser for the Yisrael to do avodah. Asher lo Shabbos. Now Shabbos arrives, and we want the isser malacha to be chal upon the isser avodah. So we'll say migu the kamitzer b'malacha, since we're not adding the isser to any more people, so it's not isser noisif, but it's isser koilel, because this yid is not only usher to do avoid in the Beis Hamikdash, he's usher to do any malacha. So midu the kamitzer b'malacha, since he's becoming usher to do any malachas, because it's Shabbos, mitzer nami ba'avoida, he'll also have an isser Shabbos to do the avoida. So that's how we can apply the concept of isser koilel to the first case of a zor who did avoida on Shabbos. Now let's see how the isser koilel works with the second case. The second case was a kohen balmum who's not allowed to do avoida, who also became tamei in a case where it was tum hutcher b'tzibur, and he did avoida when he was tamei. Does he get pets for being a balmum or also for being tamei? So the Gemara says it's the same thing. Meikara shari b'achila b'asher b'avoida. At first, he was just a regular kohen balmum. A kohen balmum may not do avoida, but he is allowed to eat karbanis. So at the beginning, before he became tamei, this kohen was allowed to eat kachim. He just wasn't allowed to do the avodah kachim. Itmulei, and now he became tamei. So what's going to happen is now he's also going to have a bigger isser. Now he can't even eat it anymore. So let's say migu de kamitzer ba'achila. Since the tumah stops him from eating kachim, let's say mitzer nami ba'avodah. The tumah will also add another isser upon him to do the avodah. So two of the three cases that we've discussed, where Bar Kapar and Reb Chia argue, the narrative that their machlokes is about whether or not you say isser koilel fits in perfectly. So we're onto something. We have a good shot so far in the machlokes between Bar Kapar and Reb Chia, and we can use that to even explain the machlokes of Yosy and Reb Shimon, because if you hold like Reb Chia that you say isser koilel, so then that explains Reb Yosy ever so beautifully why, regardless, no matter who got married first between Reuven and Shimon, but there's still going to be two Isur. So we're beautiful. The problem is the third case, where Bar Kapar and Chia are arguing, will not fit in with Isur Koilel. Ela Malika, b'basachasi the mishkachas law, b'Isur Koilel mishkachas law. Let's think of the Malika. Before the Malika was done, this bird was offered to everybody, and it was offered to everybody because of Me'ila Beheftish. You're not allowed to be Me'ila Beheftish, and it's not ready to be eaten yet. As soon as the Malika occurs, instantaneously, the bird becomes an Avela, but at that very same moment, there's now a heter of Achila to Kaihanim and an Isser Achila to Zarim. So you cannot say Isser Koilel that one Isser came first and another Isser is going to be Chal upon the first Isser, because in this case, the Isser Zaris and the Isser Nevela came at precisely the same moment. So this is not a case of Koilel. So you can't say that the reason why Bar Kapara is arguing with Reb Chia is about whether Isser Koilel works, because this case where they're arguing happens to be not a case of Isser Koilel. Let me just finish the sentence. So therefore, our whole theory was just blown out of the water. Bar Kapara and Reb Chia cannot be arguing about Isser Koilel. It blows up our theory about how we were going to explain Rabbi Yossi, and we're back to square one. That everybody holds there's no such thing as Isser Koilel, and therefore Rabbi Yossi, when he said you're over both Yisurim, Eshazach and the Chosisha, we have to go to that second-rate shot that it just means that we bury him with the Rishon Gemor. I'm sorry, Moshe, what are you saying?
I'm thinking that our whole goal is to explain why Rabbi Yossi says Yechayev twice. So we had an Eitzer to Isser Koilel. The Isser of the two things coming up of Asachas is all the more good. And those Isser Koilel we have to dray. We have to say, since one came, it gets the other. Isser Asachas, it's perfect. They come to the same thing.
About Isser Asach, we didn't get to. We're about to step over into the threshold of the Sugya of Basachas. And Basachas will actually be a very good option to investigate, exactly like what you're saying. And we're actually just about to do that. So let's step now let's step over the threshold. We've put Isser Koil temporarily behind us, and now we're investigating the concept of Vasachas. And you're 100% right when you say that if you hold of Isser Koil, you'll for sure hold of Vasachas. But if you hold of Vasachas, you might not necessarily hold of Isser Koil, because Vasachas is even a stronger svara to say that Isser Chalal is. That is exactly the opinion of the Gemara. So let's have a look at the Gemara here. Zog the Gemara, Ella kamivically be'isr bevasachas. The machlokes is about isr bevasachas. So now we need to stop a second because we have to recalibrate everything. The last case of the Zor eating from Malika, yeah, that happened. The two Isurim, the Zarus, and the Nevela happened at precisely the same time. But based on what we discussed, the case of the Balmum and the Tumah, the two Isurim did not come at the same time. The case of the Zor doing Avodah, the two Isurim, Shabbos and Zor, does not come at the same time. And for that matter, the case of Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon, where they were married to sisters, where Eshesach and the Chosisha, they didn't either come at the same time. So if we want to say that this whole story is about Bivasachas, now we have to reevaluate all these cases and demonstrate that these cases where the two Isurim happened at precisely the same time. And that's what we're going to discuss now. So before we get into the three cases of Reb Chia and Bar Kapara, let's look at our brisa. How is it possible that the Isra of Achos Isha and the Isra of Ezeshach happened at precisely the same time? So when I got pshat in this, I had big chalishas adas, and I'll tell you why. Because this is the pshat that I had. Rashi tells us what happened is Reuven and Shimon decided that they wanted to marry Rachel and Leah. Two brothers wanted to marry two sisters. So Reuven and Shimon took one ring and they gave it to a shliach, and they told the shliach, use this ring to be Mekadosh Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah, they said, we want to get Kedushin from Reuven and Shimon, so they hired a shliach and told the shliach, please be Mekabel the Kedushin on our behalf. So when the shliach of Reuven and Shimon gave the ring to the shliach of Rachel and Leah, at that instant, both marriages occurred. So Isra Eshes Ach occurred at precisely the same time as Isra Chazisha. So that's how we're now learning the case of the machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yosy holds the reason why both Isurim are there is because both Isurim came at the same time. Why was I a little disappointed is because I don't even have two daughters left to marry off. I only have one daughter. So I couldn't use this trick to make two weddings in one shot. But anybody else who still has two daughters available can use this trick to marry off two daughters at the same time. So anyway,
yes. I still understand. You have three cases. Two cases work out perfectly.
We have four cases.
With three arguments. Three cases, the arguments between Bar Kapara.
There's three cases of Bar Kapara and
the
one case of our Mishnah.
As long as we find that not all three cases have to have the same argument. So the first two cases have the argument of Isser Koil. The last case says of Vasachas. But that still allows us to show, like you're saying, you want to find that somebody holds Isser Koil. You could have the first two cases hold Isser Koil, and the third case has Isser Vasachas, and we're in perfect shape.
It's a very good point, but it seems very strongly from the Gemara on Amud Beis that all these three cases were the same machlokes. You want to say maybe there are two different machlokes, but it seems when you read the Gemara, if you see from the Gemara here, that the Gemara wants to say that all of these machlokes are the same machlokes, and it makes sense to say that because the tinus that they were throwing back and forth on Amud Beis were identical. So it seems like from the Gemara's perspective, all of these three machlokes are going to be about the same thing. So let's see what the Gemara says. We've already explained how the Zaris and the Nevela comes with Asachas. We've now explained how the Eshes Ach and the Chos Isha comes with Asachas. Now let's try the other cases that we need to look at. So Zok Gemara El Kamivli be'Isem b'Asachas v'Libedu Rabbi Yosy. And the machlokes is, according to Rabbi Yosy, does the fact that the two Isurim came at the same time, does that make it that both Isurim could be chal? Rabbi Chia Tzavar, Rabbi Yosy be'Isur b'Asachas mechayev tarti. Reb Chia learns that Rabbi Yossi holds that when the two Isurim come together, you're mechuyev on both Isurim are chal, and that will allow once again us to learn Pshat Reb Yossi that there's really two carbon chatases. According to Barkapar, we still have to stick with the same shot we had before in Rabbi Yossi, that it's just about burying him in the basic forest with Rosh Hashanah. How are we going to explain these two cases where they were occurring at the same time? So let's take one at a time. Zar Shashimesh b'Shabbos, the Yisrael who did avodah on Shabbos. How could it be possible that the Isser of Shabbos came at the same time as this is to do avodah? He was already asked to do avodah before Shabbos. Dr. Marcus, we're talking about a cotton who first became a gadol on Shabbos. Going to Icy Shtei Cyrus b'Shabbos. He became a gadol on Shabbos. So when he became a gadol, at that moment, both the Isser Shabbos was chal upon him, as well as the Isser to do avodah was chal upon him at that very same moment. So that's the explanation of how Zor Shashimish b'Shabbos would have been the Basachas. Balmum Nami, the case of the Balmum who did avoid when he was Tomei, you could say exactly the same idea. So it's speaking where he was a Balmum and he was Tomei, but he was a cotton. And then after he was Tomei, after he was a Balmum, then he got to Shtei Cyrus. The Isser of avodah because he's a Balmum and the Isser of avodah because he's Tomei are chal upon him at the same moment. Inami, or we have another option. He's a regular gadol, but he was not a Balmum. But he cut his hand with a Tomei sakin. So at the same moment that he got injured, at that same moment he became Tomei. So we have two ways where this could be Bavasach. So now the Gemara is saying that the machloikus between Bar Kapara and the machloikus between Bar Kapara and Reb Chia, if Bavasachas works to say Isser Chalal Isser, is just that, and the machloikus is about what Rabbi Yossi's opinion is. So it seems like according to Reb Shimon, who says there's only one Isser because Ein Isser Chalal Isser, everybody agrees according to Reb Shimon Bavasachas wouldn't help. But according to Rabbi Yossi, there's a machloikus. Does Bavasachas help that both Isurim should be chal, like Reb Chia holds, and therefore Rabbi Yossi can learn it's a real Isser Chalal Isser, and you bring two carbon chatases? Or do you say even in Rabbi Yossi, like Bar Kapar, even in Rabbi Yossi, you don't say Isser Chalal Isser, and it's not really two Isurim, it's just that he's a Rosh Hashanah. So Dr. Gemara, Bishlamul Reb Chia, the way Reb Chia learned it. So let's just remind ourselves what the conversation was between Reb Chia and Bar Kapara. If you remember, they both said, I swear I heard this from Rebbe. Reb Chia said, I swear I heard from Rebbe that there's two Isurim, and Bar Kapara said, I swear I heard from Rebbe there was one Isur. Now, when I learned this Gemara the first time, I said, someone's got to be wrong here. Rebbe couldn't have said two contradictory things, and that's what the Gemara hones in upon. And the Gemara is trying to explain why they had a difference of opinion as to what Rebbe said. So Zok Gemara, Bishtamel Reb Chia, ki asna l'didei, when Rebbe told Reb Chia, I'll leave with Reb Yossi, Reb Chia would learn that when Rebbe told me that Isser Chalal Isser by Bavasachas, he was talking according to Reb Yossi. I think that Bar Kapara made up a story that Rebbe told him that is only one Isser, not two Isser? No. I think Bar Kapara misunderstood Rebbe. And when Rebbe told Bar Kapara that Ein Isser Chalal Isser, he asked him Bar Kapara, when Rebbe told Bar Kapara there's only one Isser, I'll leave it to Reb Shimon. That was according to Reb Shimon. I also agree, according to Reb Shimon, you don't say that the two Isurim are chal b'basachas. I'm only saying Rabbi Yossi holds that the two Isurim are chal b'basachas. So yes, Rebbe might have told you, Bar Kapara, that the Isurim are not chal one on the other. But he's not talking about Rabbi Yossi. He's talking about Reb Shimon. So therefore, it's not a stira. Rebbe could have told Bar Kapara one thing, and he could have told Reb Chia another thing, and they're not contradictory. What he told Bar Kapara was according to the Shita of Reb Shimon, and what he told Reb Chia was according to the Shita of Reb Yossi. That's beautiful. That would be the perspective of Reb Chia in this machlokes. El Bar Kapara. Let's look at Bar Kapara's perspective in this machlokes. Bar Kapara said that according to Reb Yosy, even according to Reb Yosy, who's more inclined to say Isra Chalal Isra, even according to Reb Yosy, Rebbe told me that ain't Isra Chalal Isra. Well, then what did Rebbe mean when he told Reb Chia that yes, Isra Chalal Isra? The only way for Bar Kapara to explain it is Reb Chia Shikur Kamishakar. So are you going to suggest that Bar Kapara, from Bar Kapara's perspective, Reb Chia was lying and making up a story that Rebbe told him something? That doesn't make sense. So therefore, we cannot say that the machlokes is according to Reb Yosy, because then from Bar Kapara's perspective, Reb Chia was making up a story and lying about something that Rebbe never said. Elo kamifagli be'isur basachas. Let's say they're arguing about Isur basachas, but not only with Reb Yosy, but with Reb Shimon. Let's say they're arguing according to Reb Shimon, which means that Reb Chia said that the brayso that we learned about the two brothers is not speaking about a case of basachas. It's speaking about uzeh charzeh. And we remain with the pshat that we had in the brayso yesterday, that ein yisur chalal isur, even according to Reb Yosy, and it's just Rishon Gemur. But what would they hold in the case of basachas? So, according to Reb Chia, he heard Rebbe say that even Reb Shimon, who doesn't hold the Isur Chalal Isur, but the basachas, it would work. So, Bishlam Reb Chia, Kamishtaba, Lafuki Reb Shimon, Mechaskei. Let's think about it. When Rebbe and when Reb Chia and Bar Kapara shared their opinions of what they heard from Rebbe, they were very passionate. Reb Chia said, I swear that Rebbe said that you're chayiv both when it's bavasachas. Why would Reb Chia come out with such a passionate expression? I swear. Dr. Gemara, you know why? Because we're arguing Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon normally never says Isur Chalal Isur. Because Reb Shimon in our brayso said Isur Chalal Isur, you only get one Isur. So to convince you that Rebbe actually said that even Reb Shimon, in the case of bavasachas, would agree that Isur Chalal Isur, Reb Chia had to say it very convincingly and very passionately. I swear that Rebbe said that even Reb Shimon, who normally never says Isur Chalal Isur, here when it's bavasachas, Reb Shimon would agree that Isur Chalal Isur. El Bar Kapara, but according to Bar Kapara, where it's same old, the same way Reb Shimon says in Isur Chalal Isur everywhere else. Even bavasachas, he's saying in Isur Chalal Isur, why did Bar Kapara have to present his opinion so passionately, swearing this is what Rebbe said? So Dr. Mori, it's a good question, kasha. But we'll live with that question. Maybe you can suggest an answer that since Rebbe Chia spoke so passionately, Bar Kapara responded so passionately. But Dr. Mori, we still have a problem. Because Bishlamel Bar Kapara, if you look at Bar Kapara's perspective, Rebbe Chia won't be a liar. Because he'll say, Ki asni Rebbe l'didei, when Rebbe told me that even though it's basachas, ein Isur Chalal Isur, al liba de Reb Shimon. He was going according to Reb Shimon. And ki after Reb Chia, al liba de Reb Yosy. And Bar Kapara would say, when Reb Chia heard Rebbe tell him that Isur Chalal Isur, yes, that's going according to Reb Yosy. So Reb Chia thought that Rebbe meant according to Reb Shimon. But in fact, Rebbe meant only according to Reb Yosy. So that's a way for Bar Kapara to justify the mistake that Reb Chia made when Rebbe spoke to him. But look at this machlokes from Reb Chia's perspective. El Reb Chia, Bar Kapara Shakur Kamishakar. According to this lashon, Reb Chia held that Rebbe said that even Reb Shimon holds that Isur Chalal Isur b'vasachas. So when Bar Kapara quoted Rebbe as saying that Isur is not Chalal Isur b'vasachas, that means he's a liar. Because what else could Rebbe be referring to? Which is the same kasha the Gemara asked a moment ago, the other way around, when we thought that they were arguing according to Rabbi Yosy. Zog to Gemara, Amalach Reb Chia. No, there's a way for me to explain this as well, where it's not that Bar Kapara is lying. Bar Kapara heard something from Rebbe, but Bar Kapara misunderstood what Rebbe said. So he's not lying. Rebbe did tell him that b'vas achas, the Isser is not Chalal Isser. But Bar Kapara misunderstood what Rebbe said. So let me tell you what it's about. Really, Rebbe told me that even according to Reb Shimon, the Vasachas Isser Chalal Isser. what Rebbe heard and what Rebbe understood, what Bar Kapara heard from Rebbe, and from what I misunderstood it are two different things. He asked me, Rebbe, Lididei, let me tell you, Zok Reb Chia, what Rebbe told Bar Kapara. Tarti liftur asnaya. Remember, there's three cases here. And if you remember the first two cases, which was the Zor who did Avodah and the Balmum who did Avodah when he was Tomei, the Gemara said those two cases could occur by Isser Koilel, and they can also occur by Vasachas. But the third case of the Zor who ate a Malika, that could only occur by Vasachas, that couldn't be by Isser Koilel. So let me tell you, Zok Reb Chia, what Rebbe told Bar Kapara. What he told Bar Kapara was, Tarti liftur asnaya. Rebbe was not talking about the case of the bird. When Rebbe was talking to Bar Kapara, what he told Bar Kapara was the case of Zor who did Avodah on Shabbos, and the case of the Balmum who did Avodah when he's Tomei. There's two Yisurim. That's all he said. And Rebbe severely misunderstood. Bar Kapara severely misunderstood Rebbe. So all Rebbe said was Tarti liftur asanya. All he said was, in these two cases, the Zor who did Avodah on Shabbos and the Balmum who did Avodah when he was Tomei, he only has one Isser. He only has one Isser. That's what he was talking about. He was never talking about the case of Zor who ate from the Malika. So let's turn the daf over. I'll turn the daf over. Okay. Zog to Gemara, the Isser Koilel asanya. And when Rebbe was talking to Bar Kapara, he wasn't even discussing the sugya of Basachas. He was discussing the sugya of Isser Koilel. Because if you remember, those first two cases could have happened b'zah harzeh, and they involved the concept of Isser Koilel. And all Rebbe was telling Bar Kapara is that Reb Shimon does not hold of Isser Koilel. Reb Shimon. But Bar Kapara completely misunderstood what Rebbe told him. Bar Kapara didn't understand what Rebbe was saying, and he didn't understand that Rebbe was talking about an Isser Koilel. All he understood was that there's one action here, and there's a possibility of two Isurim. So Bar Kapara, when he took notes, he was in Shir listening to Rebbe, and he wrote notes, and he decided on his own to add a third case to the list that Rebbe never mentioned, but that he thought would be equal. And Bar Kapara added into his notes, Zor Sha'acha Malika. Why did he stick that in? Because from Bar Kapara's perspective, it's the same as the earlier two cases. One action, two avers, and it's talking about Kodesh. And that was his notes. Now came Night Seder, and he was reviewing his notes, Bar Kapara. At Night Seder, when he was reviewing his notes, he didn't remember anymore that he was the one who added in the third case. He thought that he accurately wrote down his notes from Rebbe Shir. So later on, he analyzed his notes, and the problem is on the last case that he added, which Rebbe never talked about, that could only occur, like we said, in the case of Basachas. So Bar Kapara looked at his notes and he says, the first case could be Basachas or Isser Koilel. The second case could be Basachas or Isser Koilel. But the third case of Zor Sha'acha Malika, that could only be Basachas. So it must be that what Rebbe meant to teach me was that there's no problem of Basachas, even if it's Basachas, you say Ein Yisr Chalal Yisr. And Visovar, Bar Kapara misunderstood Rebbe because he added stuff to his notes that was not ever said by Rebbe, and then he forgot that he added it. So when it came to Night Seder and he was chazering his notes, he assumed that his notes was accurate. And in fact, Rebbe stuck in the third case. He made a cheshbon b'savim midahab b'vasachas, ha'nami b'vasachas. It must be that all three cases the shaila is b'vasachas. And what did Rebbe paskin? Umidahanich lifter, hanich nami lifter. So therefore, what Reb Chia is saying, Bar Kapara, you're not a liar. You just totally messed up the shir because you added information in your notes that was nishka shtoigen, nishka floigen, and then when you're chazering at Night Seder, you messed up the whole pshat because of your mistake by adding in the other case. So the maskana of the Gemara is right now that according to Rabbi Yosy, the shaila of Vasachas could be Rabbi Yosy for sure holds that Vasachas will say Isser Chalal Isser. there's a machloikus between Bar Kapara and Reb Chia, what Reb Shimon's opinion would be about Basachas. And Reb Chia holds that Reb Shimon's opinion about Basachas would be Isser Chalal Isser. That's what he heard from Rebbe. And Bar Kapara said, no. Rebbe said that even Basachas, you don't say Isser Chalal Isser according to Reb Shimon. And that's the Maskana. So Dr. Gemara Meisvei, now the Gemara is going to slug up Bar Kapara. The Gemara is going to prove that Bar Kapara is wrong by proving that in fact Reb Shimon does agree that when the Surah Marbe Basachas, you will say Isser Chalal Isser. And here's the raya, very simple raya. The cases that we were discussing all along. Zor Sheshimus B'Shabbos. Yisrael did avoid on Shabbos. That was the first case we had. Remember, that case could occur both B'Zar Chazeh, and it'll be a Shiloh B'Sher Koilel, but it also could occur B'Basachas, and then there's a Shiloh B'Basachas. The second case is Balmum Sheshimus B'Tumah. Once again, this case, as we said, could be a case of B'Basachas, or it could be a case of B'Sher Koilel. In both these cases, Yeshkan Mishum Zaris, Umishum Shabbos, Umishum Balmum, Umishum Tumah. Look at Rabbi Yosy. Rabbi Yosy holds that Isser Chalal Isser in all these cases, and there's Isurim for everything here. Rabbi Shimon argues and says, Ein kan elo mishum zaris ubalmum bilvat. So we have this same machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yosy. If you say Isser Chalal Isser, right? But it's not clear what the discussion here is. Is this a case of B'Vasachas, and Rabbi Shimon is saying there's no B'Vasachas? Or is this a case of Isser Koilel, and Rabbi Shimon is saying there's no Isser Koilel? It's not clear. Dr. Gemara, a beautiful deal. V'ilu Malika Shaira. For some reason, the Tana only listed off the machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon by the first two cases. Yet the Tana didn't mention that they argue by Malika. So the question is, if the Tana didn't mention that Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Shimon argue by Malika, they must agree. So the question is, do they both agree that you say Isser Chalal Isser, or do they both agree that you say Ein Isser Chalal Isser in this case of Malika? So Dr. Laman Shire, who is giving in? Is Rabbi Yosy giving in, or is Rabbi Shimon giving in? Ilema le Rabbi Yosy. If you want to say that Rabbi Yosy is giving in, and Rabbi Yosy is being moida, even though I hold Isser Koilel, you'll say Isser Chalal Isser. Nevertheless, B'Vasachas, you will not say Isser Chalal Isser. Then you'll ask Moshe Weinberg's kasha. Pastor Rabbi Yosy Isser Koilel mechayev shtayim. If by Isser Koilel, which is Zach or Zeh, which the Svar is shouldn't be Chalal Isser. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yosy says Isser Chalal Isser. Surely, if the two Isurim came together, like the Zara and the Malika, surely there you'll say Isser Chalal Isser. El you're forced to say that it's Reb Shimon who's going to be moida in the case of the Malika. El Reb Shimon, and it must be Uve Isser Koilel who the Potter. Where does Reb Shimon argue and say you say Ein Isser Chalal Isser? That's only by Isser Koilel. But even Reb Shimon is moida that by a Bavas Achas, you're going to be chayiv on both Yisur. That's exactly not what Bar Kapara said. Tiyufta, the Bar Kapara Tiyufta. Bar Kapara is Ogishlogan, because we have proof here that Reb Shimon holds that by Bavas Achas, you say Isser Chalal Isser. And that's the Maskana. By Bavas Achas, you say Isser Chalal Isser. By Isser Koilel, we have a machlokes between Reb Yosy and Reb Shimon. Beautiful. Now we're finished with the complicated Gemara. From here to the end of the block, we'll take a very short period of time because it's simple. Zok to Gemara. Zor Sheshimis B'Shabbos. Zor did avoida on Shabbos. What avoida did the Zor do that in fact violates Shabbos? B'mai, what was the avoida? Ibishchita, when I touched it, originally I said it's being shechted on Shabbos. But the problem is, Shchita B'Zor Kshera. Isn't a Yisrael a lot of shecht? The halacha is that Yisrael is a lot of shecht. So why would he be called a Zor? For shechti, he's a lot of shecht. And if the avodah you're referring to that the Zohar did on Shabbos was being makabel the dam, which can only be done by a kohen, or carrying the dam to the mizbeach, which can only be done by a kohen, that's not an Isser Shabbos. Tiltul Balmud. At worst, it's muksa. But where's there an Isser Daraisa? Torah, and if it's Torah, so you have to make a fire, that wouldn't work either. Because the Amar Rabbi Yosy, this brisa is Rabbi Yosy talking. And we know Rabbi Yosy holds Havar L'Lav Yotzis. We know Rabbi Yosy holds that you're only over a lav. There's no Chiyav Kares, there's no Korban Chatas for Havara. So once again, what is the case of Zor Sheshimish? What possible Aver can a Zor do in Avodah that would involve the Chiv Chatas.
Jesse,
Yes?
what's wrong with Zrika? Why are we leaving out Zrika?
What's the Israel Rika? Why is that a Malach of Shabbos?
Oh, because it's not Malach on Shabbos.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Amar Baka Yaakov, it's Shchita. It's Shchita's K'er B'Zar. There's one Shchita that has to be done Dafke by the Kohen Gadol, and that's on Yom Kippur. The Shchita is Paroi Shal Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So this Shabbos must have been Yom Kippur as well, and the power of the Kohen Gadol may only be shechted by the Kohen Gadol. So the Zara Yisrael cannot shecht it. Uchadivrei Omer Shchita is Paroi Shal Kohen Gadol B'Zar Psula. Frank the Gemara Yachi Ma'ir Yizar Afilu Kohen Hedit Nami. Why is the case of a Zar Sheshachar? Any Kohen wouldn't be able to shecht it. Only the Kohen Gadol can shecht it. So Dr. Mar, you're right. That's what it means. Shezar Etzloi Kamar. All the Bryce meant when it said a Zar Sheshachar, it means someone who, for this particular shchita, was a Zar, and that means anybody who might have shechted it other than the Kohen Gadol. Beautiful. The problem is, I keep on saying, where is there a Chiv Chatas? Avar Lalav Yotzes, there's no Chiv Chatas. Frank Gemara, who said anything about a Chatas? Maskal or Rashi? Midi Chatos Katani? Does it say anywhere in the Bryce earlier when Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon were arguing? All it says is Yesh Kan Mishum Zarus Umishum Shabbos. It doesn't say the Chiv Chatas. Maybe it just means alav. Why are you insisting on saying it means Chatas? Midi Chatos Katani or Ilavi Katani? Elamai, it's Yisur B'alma Kachashav. All it's talking about is Yisur B'alma. So you don't even know that Rabbi Yossi is saying that Isser Chalal Isser. Maybe back to our original shot back in the Brisa 2 days ago, that Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold Isser Chalal Isser. It's just extra patch. So the Gemara says from this whole Brisa you don't have a raya anymore. Rabbi Yossi holds Isser Chalal Isser. Maybe he holds Isser Chalal Isser b'vatzach. Maybe he holds Isser Chalal Isser by Yisur Koil. It's the whole thing here is just that you give him extra patch because there's two Yisur. I mean, we still have the raya because of the fact that the Brisa makes a distinction between the first two cases and the case of Zor Shemola. But the Gemara is saying Agabarcha, this particular case might not necessarily be talking about a Chiyav Kares. It might just be speaking about a guy who's a big Russia because he's doing more affairs. Okay, now let's go to the Mishnah, a very simple Mishnah. Wife swapping is the subject of this Mishnah. Shnaim Shekitcher Shtei Noshim. 2 men marry 2 women. Now this could happen in Bnei Brak. In Bnei Brak, there's a hall that has 4 halls in the same building. So there's 4 chasnas going on in the same building at the same time. Could you imagine if after the chuppah, they mix up the wrong chassan and the wrong kala go to the yichud room? Could you imagine what could happen? Well, in the Mishnah, it discusses just that. Shnaim shekitzu shtei noshim. There were 2 weddings. 2 people made kedushin to 2 separate women, not sisters, nothing. Strangers. When they went l'chuppah, and this means to do the bia itself, hechlifu eshel zeh lo zeh v'eshel zeh lo zeh. They purposely hechlifu. They swapped the wives out. So they were both over Rachman Litzlan in being boiled and eshes. Hare'elu chayovin mishameshes. They're both chay mishameshes. V'imhayu achin. And if these 2 guys here are brothers, then not only are they over eshes, there's also an issue of eshesach. V'imhayu achin mishameshes. And what if these 2 women were sisters? It'll be mishamisha lachaitza. So we're already up to 3 isurim per person. And if these women were nidas as well, misham nida, which means each person there was over 4 averis. You can't have them go back to their original husbands until they wait 3 months because we want to know if they got pregnant. Then these kids are mamzer. So we need to know if they got pregnant through this ordeal. Shemim Mubarasin. What if there were very young little girls who could not possibly have gotten pregnant? Then then they can each go back to their respective husbands. But if they're kahanos, then this will be not truma because they're considered a zayna. You're saying they purposely swapped wives? Are you suggesting our mission is talking about such vile rishoyim? This too, and I'll ask you another question. Rabbi Chia gave a shot on our Mishnah, and he said in this case there will be 16 karbanos chatas, because if each person was over b'shoigig 4 isurim of kares, so each one has to bring 4 karban chatas. So the 2 men and the 2 women, 4 times 4 is 16. Zok to Gemara, even mazed, if you're learning Pshat Chalifa means they didn't bemazed, me ika carbon, you don't bring a carbon chatas if this was not mazed. Rabbi Yehuda, you're right. Tani hochlefu. Don't say hechalifu, meaning they purposely did it. Say hochlefu. It occurred that they got mixed up, but of course this wasn't on purpose. Hakinami mistaver, and that's the logical way to understand our Mishnah. The Katani Seifa, it says in the Seifa, Im hayu katanos she'enan riyas leile. If they were young girls, machzir noisamiyah, they can go back to their husbands. But the iba mazid, if it's bemazid, mishari, a lady who was a noyefes, it's also labal labayil. Dr. Gemara, what are you talking about? Holocaust, that's not a kasha. Peter katana onion. A woman who's mezana and she's a katana, she doesn't know the difference. That would be considered an onius. The onius miyisrael mishmashari. So that's not shver why if they're small girls, you send them back to their husbands, because they didn't become also to their husbands, because they are considered onius. Ella de katani, but the other part of the mission that says mafrishan oish shloish chadoshim, you don't let them go back to their husbands for 3 months. Shem Maborse. Frek to Gemara, halav mubaros. Sharon, are you saying if after 3 months they're not pregnant, you let them go back to their husbands? Be bemazed me Sharon. If this was bemazed, they're also labal laboil. Nobody goes back. Lav shmami no, huchlufu shmami no. It must be that our Mishnah is not talking about Rachman al where they did this bemazed. Our Mishnah must be talking about a case where this was all done b'shayig. Okay, Kabaltik, we'll stop here. We're Baruch Hashem right on the daf. Very, very gishmak Gemaras.
Yes, he don't leave.
Go ahead.
Yes, he don't leave.
Okay, so Baruch Hashem, we had the good old phone.
Yeah.
Okay, good to
Okay, get the vote.
Oh, Hermoich, Masertzach. I'm not enjoying these blood. I want to tell you something. I got to tell you something. You mama saved someone's life. Finkel's behind, right? So Finkel comes up to me in a panic after Shachar. Yosy, I'm saying this afternoon. I don't know what to do. How could it be Kiadodi Ninu and you only need 1 chalitza? If it's Kiadodi, you need 2 chalitzas. Help! So I said, you just cracked the sugi open. And I showed him the 2 toys with him. It was beautiful.
Wow, very nice. Thank you. Anyways, I have 3 questions. Start with the Mishnah, the latest Mishnah. Are we? I mean, I didn't see tomorrow's mark, but are we not going to start discussing? Go right back to the story of Isser Moisek, Isser Koil.
Yeah. The Gemara is going to show that you have all 4. You have Isser Moisek, Isser Koil, Basachas.
Fine. Then I can wait till tomorrow.
Yeah.
The second question I have is, what according to I have to review all this. But I think it's Bar Kappara. I can't remember which is which. But according to the one who says by Bavasachas, you would not have 2 chiyuvim. It was Bar Kappara. So which one would you have? What would you have? Like why does he pick?
You have the first issue that's chal. So for instance, if there's a zor who did avoid on Shabbos, it would be the Isser Zaris because Shabbos won't chal.
But where we're saying it's Bavasachas, there isn't one issue that's.
In the case of Basachas, which one would be there? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know.
I was saving that question because I didn't want to bother you too much during this year.
No, that's a beautiful gasha.
The minute we had it, I said to him, so how can anybody say that it's not chal? Because if it's not chal, then neither are chal. Like, why do you pick A over B?
That's a very good try. I don't know the answer. I'm going to have to figure that out. That's a beautiful gasha. How do you know which one?
I'm sure there's an answer. I'm sure someone.
There's an answer. Yeah. Okay. Listen. I hope it won't take me a whole Sunday like last week.
Okay. Now the next question I have is I'm going right back to the question I asked you at the beginning. Now that I learned the Gemara with you, and now that we seem to have been willing to make differences between cases 1 and 2 and case 3, so now I want to go right back and say what's stopping us from saying that it's not a question about Sachas. Let's go right back to the beginning of the Gemara and say that we're talking about Isser Koil, and case 3 is not case 1 and 2. Just like we ended up, case 3 is not case 1 and 2.
Yeah, you could say that. Who said you can't?
That's not what the Gemara is. The Gemara doesn't seem to end off with.
What are you talking about? The Brisa at the top of this very Amud, Dafka talks about only case 1 and 2 and not about case 3.
I understand. So when I'm saying, therefore, instead of throwing out the first shot of the Gemara that the machlokes between Bar Kapar and Rabbi Yossi, not Bar Kapar and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi and no, not them. I want Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon is whether there's such a thing as Isser Chalal Isser by Isser Koilel, and we threw it out because we could only find it by the first two cases of the machlokes Bar Kapar and Rabbi Chia, and we couldn't find it by Malika. So like I asked you right at that point that we gave up, and I said, why can't we differentiate? So your answer is because we see case 1, 2, and 3 somewhere in the Gemara. It doesn't feel there's a reason to differentiate. If you look at the so we are differentiating.
And I think you're right. This price here, this last price where we asked the Metzvah from, Zor Shashimish B'Shabbos Abamum Shashimish B'Tumah, clearly says that Rabbi Yossi holds of Isser Koilel. It's Mufurish. That's what this price is saying. I think you're 100% right. That's what the Metzvah was. The Metzvah was precisely proving what you're saying. Is that Zor Shashimish B'Shabbos and Ba'amum Shashimish B'Tumah is exactly a case of Isser Koilel. Exactly, so and Rabbi Yossi holds of Isser Koilel.
So we are we are going back to that, at least.
Yes, and we're saying that Rabbi Yossi holds of Isser Koilel. And you could learn back at our brisa that the Shaila was a case of Isser Koilel. So that means even if first Reuben married Leah and made the Isra Shesach, and only then did Shimon marry Rachel, it will still add Isra Chosisha on it because of Isra Koilel. So now you actually have two ways to learn the machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. This brisa clearly learns it's a question of Isra Koilel, but the Gemara had another svara of maybe learning it as Isra B'Asachas. It'll be both ways.
I didn't thought that the Gemara was retracting from that.
It has to, because from this Gemara it's black and white that the machlokes Rabbi Yossi and Shimon in this brisa is black and white Isra Koilel, because otherwise, if the Shal B'Asachas, there should have been arguing in all three cases, right? That's mamish what the brisa is saying. So the brisa clearly, the Gemara bring right from this brisa clearly that Rabbi Yossi holds of Isser Koilel.
I have a side question, which is maybe the question that you were bothered with. I was talking to my father about this also. It's bad enough that they swore once. You know, you could discuss why would they swear or whatever, but if swearing 3 times is considered a shua shav. So once you swore once, you got your point across. Now you're swearing.
I don't know if the avoida is a lotion of a shua, but I don't know if it's a mamish of a shua halachically. We're going to get up to Pesach Shavuos. We'll see if ha'avoida. But isn't the word used ha'avoida?
I don't know. I hear, but the point is, you could make. What's bothering me is you can't. They shouldn't have said it 3 times. They should have just said it 1 time.
I hear. Let me see.
It's bad enough that they said it, and whatever it seems to me.
Let me just see the Gemara here. Let's see the lotion that they used. Ha'avoida. The word is ha'avoida. So I wonder if ha'avoida is officially a shvur or if it's just a strong expression, because it never mentions the word. It never mentions the word shvur.
Right.
I'm not sure where I got. I don't know why I touched it as Lashon Shvua.
I think I saw it there.
Maybe also. I saw it in the Mesivta somewhere.
I think I saw it in our scroll, maybe over shelves, so I can't remember.
I guess in the Mesivta Shavuos, we're going to see how serious of a Lashon it is.
Anyways, connected to this a little bit, I asked for my lawyer this question because this was also bothering my father. My father gets bothered by these cases. Where Rav Sheshis, this is last week somewhere. Rav Sheshis says to Rav, it seems to me like you're asleep when you're. Yeah, like so. I was wondering. I don't know if
all the Dafim Magid this year always talk about it. And there's a standard shot for that. The standard shot is that you're such a goyin that it's only possible that you would have said such a thing if you weren't fully alert. It was a compliment. It wasn't an attack.
Right. That's what Rabbi Lowy said to me also. Says all he's saying to him is, I can't believe you would have said this if you were up.
I'm not saying that you're a shaita, you're a namort. I'm saying you're huge, but you must have been distracted at the time.
Right. So I'm using that, right? I'm using that thought to go back to our Gemara. In our Gemara, just because they said, I swear, and we say, what are you calling the guy, a liar? He's a shakran? No, I'll say he was distracted. Like, I'll give that same answer. He was distracted, and that's why he said it at a point when he was distracted. So therefore,
but the thing is, even if he said it when he was distracted, he still has to have justification for it.
not if he's distracted, he could say something that's off. Now, if that also, if that's allowed.
Let me ask you a question. If I say a svara and I'm distracted, so you can use that as an excuse. I'm tired, I'm distracted. But if I'm emphatically screaming that I'm 100% sure I heard Rebbe say this, it's a lot harder to write that off to distraction.
Yeah, well, not
It's
except
not
for
a
the fact
svara
that
that I'm saying. I'm
except
saying
for the fact that
testimony that
someone
I heard
else said
this.
except for the fact that someone else swore the opposite. In other words, we got.
But that's why it was so important for the Gemara to justify what the other guy was saying. That's why the Gemara wanted to make sure that even in each other's eyes, there should be an explanation as to where the other guy went wrong, and not that he just quoted it wrong.
Right. Now, I'm just saying that if we all of a sudden are being accept the fact, if we all of a sudden accept the fact that you could have a distraction and say something wrong, that takes away from these swears.
I hear it, but I was blown away by this particular line of the Gemara, because when I have an argument with somebody, I'll say, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe you. For half a second he said that. There's no way he said that. Reb Shlomi didn't say that. Reb Lowy didn't say that. You're making the story up. You see the respect that Reb Chia and Bar Kappara had for each other, that even though one of them thought the other one was mistaken, it's never that you don't know what you're talking about. It's always, you must have misunderstood it, but of course, I accept what you say is true. When I argue with somebody, the guy says, I spoke to Rebbe Lowy, he said not no. I don't believe you, you're making it up. There's no way Rebbe Lowy said that. Reb Chia would have never said it to Bar Kappara or vice versa. I'm a little blown away by that. Because you see that they were bar paluktis, and they held they were terribly wrong, the other guy. But they had the utmost respect for them.
Right. I teach grade 4. So what I'm saying now is on the level of grade 4. But whenever you get one of these cases, which we have very often throughout Shas and Mishnayos, I taught mainly Mishnayos, where one Tana says, I heard it differently. I heard him say this. Often it's with the Machlekes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. No, and we just had it, no, really Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai. And it happens all the time. So I always try to explain to my class in a way that at least makes sense to me. I say, you guys are all sitting here listening to me. You're all paying whatever attention you're paying. Now, let's not go back a year from now. Let's go back 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years ago. The Magachir is gone. He's not with us anymore. Now, you guys, the two guys that are arguing, they could be sitting on a cane themselves or in a wheelchair. He's saying, oh gosh, I remember way back in, whatever, in the 73 years ago, I remember it's as clear as day to me, because and that's how things could have gone wrong, because they sent him back from so long ago. And the two of them aren't lying. The two of them are 100% convinced that they're right. But that's what happens when you remember something from 73 years ago.
I hear.
That's my own, at least my way of explaining to kids, because otherwise I can't explain to them how two people say things that are totally opposite of each other.
I hear. It makes sense.
I'm not saying that's for grade 10 or 30-year-olds, but I'm saying at least and I think it works. I think they can hear it a little.
It's a nice thought.
And I acted out a little also.
Okay, shkoyach.
Okay.